At their own 5-year gala, in front of 150 of the city's elite, Elsa's husband drenched her white designer gown in red wine, and announced their marriage was a lie. Then he called her a commoner. Then he introduced his new, high-society fiancée. But what the power players in that ballroom didn't see coming, was the tattooed stranger who emerged from the shadows, lifted Elsa into a bridal carry, and dismantled her husband's legacy with 3 cold words. And what no one realized, was that the man who saved her was the one person her husband feared most. The crystal ballroom of the Roche Plaza hummed with the sound of old money and expensive perfume. 5 years of architectural brilliance. 150 elites. A perfect facade of a power couple. Elsa had spent half a decade designing the very skyline they were celebrating, every blueprint a testament to her loyalty, every building a stone in the empire she thought she shared. Then Danny stained it. "Our marriage is null and void," he boomed, his voice cutting through the music as he tipped his glass, sending dark red wine splashing across Elsa's pristine white gown. Stunned silence. The flash of cameras. The collective lowering of eyes. And then the calculated execution. She doesn't have the pedigree for the Roche future. She was a temporary asset. The grand doors swung open. In walked a younger socialite, dripping in diamonds Elsa had once seen in Danny's safe, her hand resting possessively on his arm. "This," Danny announced to the room, "is the woman who will truly lead this city by my side." The weight of the betrayal crushed the air from Elsa's lungs. Her legs trembled. Her world tilted. She began to fall. But while the elites looked away, while the crowd recorded her shame, a heavy, rhythmic step echoed against the marble. One man moved. And by the time Danny Roche realized who was standing in his ballroom, his empire had already begun to burn. The silence that followed Danny's announcement was not the silence of respect, it was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a courtroom before a sentence is read. Elsa stood paralyzed, the red wine seeping into the fibers of her white gown like an spreading wound. She looked at the faces of the 150 elites, men and women she had toasted with, designed for, and defended. Not one of them met her gaze. They looked at their polished shoes, their shimmering diamonds, or the bubbles in their glasses. They were witnessing her social execution, and by their silence, they were pulling the lever. Danny stood on the stage, his chest puffed out, a man who believed he had finally purged the only person who knew he was a fraud. He reached down, his fingers tightening around Elsa's trembling arm to physically usher her toward the exit, to cast her out like refuse into the night. "Don't touch me," Elsa whispered, but her voice was a ghost, thin and breaking. "You're making a scene, Elsa," Danny hissed, his face contorted in a mask of artificial pity. "Just go quietly. You don't belong here anymore." Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom didn't just open. They groaned under the weight of an authority that no one in that room possessed. A rhythmic, deliberate thud of leather boots against marble cut through the whispers. Dai Chin-hei did not walk like a guest. He walked like an owner inspecting his property. His black suit was sharp enough to bleed on, and as he moved under the glare of the chandeliers, the intricate ink climbing his neck and weaving across the backs of his hands seemed to pulse. The elites didn't just move aside. They scrambled, creating a wide, fearful path. They knew the face of the man who held the deeds to their penthouses and the debts of their firms. Dai stopped 5 feet from the stage. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the pregnant mistress. His cold, obsidian eyes were fixed solely on Danny's hand, which was still gripped tightly around Elsa's arm. "Get your hands off her," Dai said. The voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, vibrational frequency that seemed to rattle the crystal glasses on the tables. It was a cold command, devoid of heat but full of teeth. Danny froze. His bravado began to leak out of him like air from a punctured tire. This is a private matter, Mr. Hay." "My wife." "She is not your wife," Dai interrupted, his voice even quieter now, more dangerous. And she is certainly not yours to touch. Day stepped onto the platform. The height difference was marginal, but Danny seemed to shrink, his aggressive posture collapsing into a frantic, sweating twitch. Day didn't wait for a response. He leaned in, his tattooed hand hovering inches from Danny's chest. Danny recoiled as if burned, stumbling back into his new fiancée. As Elsa's knees finally gave way, she didn't hit the cold marble. Day was already there. He caught her with a strength that felt like iron wrapped in silk. He slid one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees, lifting her easily. Elsa buried her face into the crook of his neck, her long braids falling over his shoulder. For the first time in 5 years, the weight of the world wasn't on her shoulders, it was being carried by someone else. Day turned his back on the stage, ignoring the gasps and the frantic clicking of phone cameras. As he carried the broken architect through the center of the room, 150 of the city's most powerful people did the only thing they could do in the presence of true power. They lowered their eyes. The scent of expensive cedar and sterilized air was the first thing to greet Elsa as her consciousness flickered back to life. She didn't open her eyes immediately, she let her senses map the space. Beneath her was the cool, buttery smoothness of Italian leather. The air was silent, devoid of the cruel whispers and camera shutters that had been the soundtrack to her collapse. When she finally opened her eyes, she was met with a ceiling of reinforced glass. Beyond it, the midnight city skyline glittered like a spilled box of diamonds. She realized she wasn't just in a penthouse, she was in the crown of the fortress, the high-tech estate that overlooked the very district she had spent years blueprinting. "You're awake," a voice said. It was the same low frequency that had silenced the ballroom, cold, but no longer cutting. Elsa sat up slowly, her braids spilling over her shoulder. The white gown was gone, replaced by a silk robe that felt like a second skin. Dae Chin-hye sat in a minimalist armchair across from her, a tablet in his hand and the city lights reflecting off the tattoos on his neck. He looked less like a monster and more like a predator at rest. "Where am I?" Elsa's voice was raspy, the trauma of the gala still clogging her throat. "In a place where Danny Roche's name holds no weight," Day replied. He didn't offer her water or comfort, he offered her a folder. "I don't believe in empty condolences, Elsa. I believe in leverage. You spent 5 years building his empire. Did you ever look at the foundations?" Elsa took the folder, her fingers trembling. As an architect, she knew foundations better than anyone, but as a wife, she had never questioned the soil her life was built on. She flipped through the pages, bank statements, land deeds, and shell company registries. "My family has owned the land under the Roche developments for 3 generations, Day said, his eyes tracking her as she scanned the documents. Danny thought he was clever. He's been embezzling from the land contracts, shifting funds into offshore accounts to pay for his mistress's lifestyle and his own gambling debts. He was robbing us to look like a king to you." Elsa's heart hammered against her ribs. "If he was stealing from you, why didn't you stop him?" Day leaned forward, the light catching the sharp angle of his jaw. "Because of you. Every time I prepared to liquidate his firm, a new set of blueprints would cross my desk. Your blueprints. You were the only thing keeping that firm legitimate. Your designs were the only reason the investors stayed, and your integrity was the only reason I didn't burn his world down years ago." He stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling glass. "Tonight, he didn't just throw you away, Elsa. He threw away his shield. He thinks he's free to start a new legacy with a pedigree bride. He doesn't realize that without your name on those permits, he's just a thief standing in a house of cards." Elsa looked down at the papers. The betrayal was no longer just emotional, it was structural. Danny hadn't just used her heart, he had used her brilliance to mask his crimes. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at the man who had carried her out of the wreckage. Day turned back to her, a ghost of a cold smile touching his lips. "Now, we let the cards fall. And then, We build something that actually belongs to you. By the time the sun climbed over the city's jagged skyline, the world Elsa had built brick by brick was being systematically demolished. She sat at a marble kitchen island in Day's estate, her eyes burning as she scrolled through her professional portal. It was gone. The architectural license she had earned through years of sleepless nights and grueling exams sat behind a red banner of text, status, revoked. The official complaint was a masterpiece of character assassination. Danny hadn't just filed for divorce, he had filed a massive professional negligence claim. He alleged that Elsa had made critical structural errors in their latest high-rise project, errors he claimed to have just discovered, and that she had been mentally unstable for months. To the board, it looked like a disgraced wife lashing out through poor workmanship. To the city, it was the final nail in the coffin of Elsa W. Barkley. "He's not just taking my name," Elsa whispered, the glow of the screen reflecting the tears she refused to let fall. "He's taking my ability to ever work again. No firm will touch a designer who's been flagged for structural instability." A shadow fell over the tablet. Day stood behind her, his presence as silent and heavy as a mountain. He didn't offer a tissue, he offered a cup of black coffee. "He's trying to erase your future so you can't fight him for the past," Day said, his voice a low rumble. "A woman without a career can't afford a lawyer who can match his. I have the blueprints, Day. I can prove the designs were sound." "It won't matter in the court of public opinion," Day countered, his tattooed fingers tapping the counter. "Danny has already spent the morning calling every major developer in the tri-state area. He's told them you're a liability. He's even blamed the recent permit delays on your incompetence rather than his own embezzlement. By noon, you won't just be divorced, you'll be a pariah." The phone on the counter buzzed, a notification from a news app. A headline flashed. "Roche Empire parts ways with lead designer amid safety concerns." Beneath it was a photo from the gala, not of the wine being thrown, but of Elsa collapsing, framed to make her look hysterical and weak. Elsa felt the familiar weight of panic clawing at her throat, the sensation of falling that had started in the ballroom. But then she looked at the man standing across from her. Day wasn't looking at the news, he was looking at her, his expression as unreadable as stone. "He thinks he's cornered you," Day said, his eyes narrowing. "He thinks that by revoking your license, he's turned you into a ghost. But Danny Roche is a man who only understands the rules of the light. He has no idea what happens when you move into the shadows." Elsa gripped the edge of the marble, her knuckles turning white. The shame that had kept her head down for the last 12 hours began to harden into something sharper. Something dangerous. "He wants me to be a ghost?" she asked, her voice finally steadying. "Let him," Day replied, a dark glint in his eyes. "A ghost is the only thing that can walk through walls. And while he's busy celebrating your failure, we are going to make sure that the next building he tries to open is the one that buries him." The silence in the room wasn't empty, it was a vast, open space waiting for a new blueprint. Elsa looked at her hands, the same hands that had drafted the icons of the city's skyline, now shaking as she processed the death of her career. She felt like a structure whose load-bearing walls had been kicked out, leaving her suspended in the air, waiting for the final collapse. Day didn't move to comfort her. Instead, he walked to a massive mahogany desk at the far end of the room and pressed a button. A section of the wall slid away, revealing a panoramic drafting table illuminated by soft, recessed lighting. Resting on the surface was a blank roll of vellum and a set of professional-grade drafting tools. The exact weight and brand Elsa had used for years. "Your license is a piece of paper issued by people Danny can bribe," Day said, his voice cutting through the gloom. "But your mind is something he can't touch. I don't care about the board's stamps. I care about the fact that you are the only person alive who understands how to build a legacy that lasts." He stepped aside, gesturing to the table. "I am commissioning a new global headquarters for the Hay Group. It will be the tallest structure in the Northern Hemisphere. It will require a vision that blends brutalist security with the elegance of high art. It is a project so large it will make Danny Roche's entire portfolio look like a collection of backyard sheds. Elsa walked toward the table, her fingers grazing the cool edge of a silver drafting scale. The familiar weight of the tool felt like a lifeline. You want me to design the Hay Tower? Everyone in the world is bidding for that contract. Why me? Because you have nothing left to lose, Day said, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. And because you know exactly how Danny builds. To destroy him, I don't need a soldier. I need an architect who can see the cracks in his foundation before he even lays the first brick. Elsa looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his obsidian gaze. And what about the legalities? Danny has the best lawyers money can buy. He's already filed to nullify the marriage so he doesn't have to pay me a cent of the equity I built. A dark, cold shadow of a smile crossed Day's face. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive, placing it on the table beside the drafting scale. Let Danny play with lawyers. I play with reality. While you design my tower, my people will be refiling your paperwork through channels Danny doesn't even know exist. By the time he realizes what is happening, he won't just be paying you equity. He'll be signing over the deeds to the very projects you designed for him. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I handle the divorce. I handle the board. I handle the man who humiliated you. All you have to do is build me an empire that casts a shadow long enough to bury the Roche name forever. Elsa looked from the flash drive to the blank vellum. The choice was clear. She could remain a victim of the light, or she could become the architect of the shadows. She picked up a graphite pencil, the weight of it solid and certain in her hand. When do we start? She asked. Now, Day replied. The city is watching. Let's give them something to fear. The City Planning Commission's boardroom was a cathedral of wood paneling and high-stakes bureaucracy, a place where the future of the skyline was decided by a handful of men with expensive pens. Danny Roche sat at the center of the long table, his silk tie loosened just enough to signal he felt he owned the room. He was surrounded by his new legal team and his pregnant fiancée, Chisholm, who preened beside him. He was there to finalize the permits for his new, legacy tower, the project he had stolen from Elsa's hard drive only a week prior. The permits are a formality, Chairman, Danny said, his voice brimming with the unearned confidence of a man who thought his greatest obstacle was in his rearview mirror. The Roche name is synonymous with this city's growth. We are ready to break ground tomorrow. The chairman of the commission didn't look at Danny. He was looking at the double doors at the back of the hall. We cannot move to a vote yet, Mr. Roche. We are waiting for the primary stakeholder of the district for land titles. As of 48 hours ago, all building rights in that sector have been consolidated under a new partnership. Danny's smile faltered. That's impossible. My firm has the... The doors swung open. The sound was sharp, the rhythmic click of high heels echoing against the marble like a countdown. Elsa walked in first. She was no longer the broken woman in a wine-stained gown. She wore a charcoal gray power suit tailored to a razor's edge, her braids swept back into a high, regal crown. Her face was a mask of architectural precision, cold, symmetrical, and immovable. 2 steps behind her walked Day Chin Hei. He wore no tie, his black shirt open at the collar to reveal the dark ink climbing his throat. He didn't look at the board, he looked at the back of Danny's head with the detached interest of a scientist watching a trapped insect. The room went airtight. Danny's jaw dropped so low it looked grotesque. Elsa? What the hell are you doing here? This is a closed session for developers. Security, remove this woman. She's had her license revoked for gross incompetence. Elsa didn't flinch. She walked straight to the head of the table, placing a leather-bound portfolio directly in front of the chairman. She didn't look at Danny until she was standing directly across from him. My license status is currently under federal review due to evidence of corporate sabotage and identity fraud, Danny, Elsa said, her voice calm and resonant, filling every corner of the silent room. But my presence here today isn't as an architect. It's as the managing partner of Hay International. Day stepped forward, leaning his tattooed hands on the back of Elsa's chair. The chairman stood up immediately, offering a shallow bow that sent a ripple of shock through Danny's legal team. Mr. Hey, the chairman stammered. We weren't informed you'd be attending personally. I'm not, Day said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that made Danny's hands begin to shake. I'm here as an observer. Ms. Barkley has total discretionary power over all Hay land holdings. If you want to build on our soil, you don't talk to me. You talk to her. Elsa opened her portfolio, sliding a single document across the polished wood toward Danny. It was a formal stop work order. I've reviewed the plans for your legacy tower, Danny, Elsa said, a ghost of a cold smile touching her lips. They're derivative, structurally flawed, and most importantly, they sit on Hay land. As of this moment, your permits are denied. If you want to move a single shovelful of dirt in this city, you'll have to submit a formal request to my office for review. Danny looked from the paper to Elsa, his face turning a frantic, mottled red. You can't do this. I built that firm. I made you. No, Elsa replied, leaning in until she could see the sweat on his brow. You stole from me. And now, you're going to find out exactly what it's like to try and build something when the foundation is owned by the woman you tried to destroy. Danny turned to the board, pleading, but they had already lowered their eyes. The power hadn't just shifted, it had been rebuilt. And Elsa was the only one with the keys. The legal retaliation from Danny was as predictable as it was desperate. Within 48 hours of the Planning Commission disaster, Elsa sat in a sterile, glass-walled conference room, facing a phalanx of Roche's high-priced attorneys. Danny sat at the head of the table, his face twisted into a smirk of feigned triumph. He had filed an emergency injunction and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, claiming that every design Elsa had produced during their marriage was a trade secret and the intellectual property of Roche Developments. You can't just walk away with my company's assets, Elsa, Danny said, leaning back and tenting his fingers. Every line you drew, every sketch you made while under my roof and on my payroll, belongs to me. You're in breach of contract. If you use so much as a single pillar from those designs for Day's Tower, I'll have you in prison for industrial espionage. His lead lawyer pushed a thick stack of papers across the table. Our client is prepared to settle for the full transfer of all Hay Group land rights back to Roche Developments in exchange for dropping the criminal charges. It's a generous offer for a woman with a revoked license. Elsa didn't look at the papers. She didn't look at Danny. She looked at Day, who was leaning against the far wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression as unreadable as a deep-sea trench. The tattoos on his hands were partially hidden by the sleeves of his charcoal suit, but the stillness of his posture was more intimidating than any verbal threat. Generous, Day repeated, the word sounding like a shard of ice hitting the floor. He stepped toward the table, his presence causing the lawyers to instinctively pull back. He didn't look at them, he looked at Danny. It's a shame your legal team didn't look closer at the soil your empire was built on, Danny. Or the ink. Day pulled a single, yellow document from his inner pocket, not a modern corporate contract, but something that looked like it belonged in a vault of ancient deeds. It was a Sicilian-style master agreement, an ironclad document from the Hay family's private archives, signed by Danny 5 years ago when he was a struggling developer desperate for his first land grant. Do you remember this, Danny? Day asked, his voice a low, terrifying hum. When you begged my father for the rights to build the Roche Plaza? You signed a master partnership agreement. You were so busy looking at the dollar signs that you didn't read the fine print regarding creative equity. Day slid the document to the center of the table. Elsa's eyes widened as she read the clause highlighted in red. The contract stated that in any project involving hay land, the lead visionary, explicitly defined as the person who authored the blueprints, retained 100% of the intellectual property and creative ownership, regardless of marital or employment status. Because Elsa was the sole architect of record for every hayland project Danny had ever touched, the trade secrets didn't belong to the Roche firm. They belonged to her. "This is a ghost contract," Danny's lawyer stammered, his face turning gray. "This shouldn't be legal." "It's not just legal. It's foundational," Day replied, leaning over the table until he was inches from Danny's sweating face. "In my world, we don't steal from the hands that build. You didn't just lose the land, Danny. According to this, Elsa owns the copyrights to every building you currently have under management. You don't own a legacy. You're just a tenant in her world." Danny reached for the paper, his hands shaking, but Elsa placed her hand firmly on top of it. She looked him in the eye, the fear that had once paralyzed her replaced by a cold, architectural clarity. "I'm not settling, Danny," she said, her voice steady and sharp. "I'm taking it all back. Every brick. Every beam. Every stolen dream. You wanted a war over assets. You just found out you're bankrupt." As Danny's lawyers began to whisper frantically, realizing their case had dissolved into dust, Day placed a hand on Elsa's shoulder. It wasn't just a gesture of protection, it was a coronation. The elites had lowered their eyes at the gala, but soon, they would be bowing. The dust of the construction site rose in pale, swirling plumes, coating the skeletal steel of the new Hay Group headquarters in a fine gray powder. Elsa stood in the center of the chaos, her charcoal suit protected by a high-visibility vest, a hard hat resting over her braids. She held a set of physical blueprints, her eyes tracking the crane as it lowered a massive I-beam into place. For the first time in years, the air she breathed didn't feel like a husband's permission, it felt like progress. The roar of a high-end engine interrupted the rhythmic thrum of the jackhammers. A black luxury sedan, one Elsa recognized with a sickening jolt in her stomach, screeched to a halt at the edge of the site, kicking up a spray of gravel. Danny scrambled out of the car, his tie gone, his hair disheveled, looking like a man who had spent the last 48 hours watching his bank accounts drain into the abyss. "Stop the work!" Danny screamed, his voice cracking as it competed with the machinery. He stormed toward Elsa, ignoring the protests of the foreman. "This is my design. You're using my structural concepts. I'll have every one of you arrested for trespassing." Elsa didn't move. She watched him approach, her face as still as the concrete pouring nearby. Danny reached her, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of desperation and cheap scotch. He looked small against the backdrop of the rising skyscraper. "You think you've won because of some ancient contract?" Danny hissed, his finger pointing aggressively into her chest. "I built this city. I have friends in every precinct, Elsa. You and your tattooed thug are going to find out what happens when you try to play in the big leagues. I'll burn this site to the ground before I let you finish it." He reached out to grab the blueprints from her hands, his face contorting into the same aggressive mask he had worn at the gala. "Give them to me. They're mine." Before his fingers could graze the paper, the world around them seemed to shift. The noise of the construction didn't stop, but the atmosphere grew heavy, cold, and electric. From behind the massive concrete pillars and out of the shadows of the idling trucks, a dozen men emerged. They didn't shout. They didn't run. They simply moved into a perfectly synchronized semicircle behind Elsa. They wore dark tailored suits that looked out of place in the dirt, their hands clasped in front of them, their expressions as void of emotion as the stone foundations. One man, standing directly behind Elsa's right shoulder, shifted his sleeve just enough to reveal the dark ink of a tiger winding up his forearm, the mark of the Hay family's inner circle. Day wasn't among them, but his presence was undeniable. The silent wall of men stood like a fortress, their eyes fixed on Danny with a predatory stillness. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. The sheer weight of their collective silence was a physical blow. It was the silence of the Sicilian way. The quiet that precedes a permanent erasure. Danny's hand stopped inches from Elsa. His fingers began to tremor. He looked at the man with the tiger tattoo, then at the three others who had effectively cut off his path back to his car. The bravado that had fueled his drive over vanished, replaced by a primal, instinctive terror. He realized he wasn't arguing with an ex-wife anymore, he was poking a sleeping dragon that didn't use lawyers to settle debts. Danny didn't say another word. He backed away, his eyes wide and darting, stumbling over a pile of rebar. He turned and sprinted back to his sedan, the tires screaming as he fled the site, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of dust. Elsa took a slow, deep breath, the blueprint still firm in her grip. She didn't look back at the men. She didn't have to. She knew they were there, and for the first time, the shadows didn't feel like a threat. They felt like home. She looked back up at the crane, her voice steady and clear. "Keep working," she commanded. "We have a deadline to meet." The downfall of Danny Roche didn't happen with a bang, but with the soft, clinical chime of 100,000 smartphones receiving the same notification at once. Danny sat in his high-rise office, the air conditioning humming a tune of false security, as he watched his new fiancée, Chisholm, pack her designer bags. She wasn't crying. In fact, she looked bored. The pregnant belly that had been the centerpiece of the gala scandal was gone, replaced by a flat, athletic stomach and a cold, professional gaze Elsa had never seen during their friendship. "The silicone prosthetic is in the trash, Danny," Chisholm said, tossing a burner phone onto his mahogany desk. "And the children I brought to the gala? They're actors. They've already been paid and sent home." Danny's face drained of color, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water. "What? What are you talking about?" "Chisholm, we're starting a family. We're building a legacy." "There is no legacy," she replied, her voice devoid of the warmth she had used to manipulate him for months. "I don't even like you, Danny. I work for Hay International. Specifically, I work for Day Chin Hay's private intelligence sector. My job was to get close enough to your private server to download the last 5 years of your offshore ledger. You made it remarkably easy. Men like you always do when they think they're being admired." As if on cue, the glass walls of his office seemed to vibrate with the sheer volume of the news breaking across the city. The flash drive Day had shown Elsa weeks ago hadn't just been for the divorce, it was the detonator. By noon, the Department of Justice had frozen every asset tied to the Roche name. The embezzlement Elsa had suspected was now a matter of public record, detailed in a 300-page indictment that traced every stolen cent back to Danny's gambling debts and Chisholm's fake lifestyle. The betrayal was total. Danny had destroyed his marriage for a woman who was a shadow, a plant designed to lead him directly into the trap he had built for himself. Outside, the market was reacting with predatory efficiency. The Roche stock didn't just dip. It plummeted into the red, a vertical line representing the death of a name. One by one, the major investors, the very elites who had lowered their eyes at the gala, released public statements. They weren't just distancing themselves from Danny, they were announcing their move. The narrative had shifted. Elsa W. Barkley was no longer the incompetent ex-wife, she was the architectural genius who had been holding the city's skyline together while a thief tried to take the credit. By sunset, the Legacy Tower project was officially dead, and the investors were flocking to the Hay Group's headquarters. They were following the talent, not the name. Elsa stood in Day's glass-walled office, watching the news ticker at the bottom of the screen. Roche Developments files for bankruptcy. Elsa Barkley named lead architect for Hay Global. "He's gone," she whispered, the weight that had been crushing her chest since the gala finally lifting. Day stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the neon glow of the city. He didn't turn around, but his voice was a warm, heavy anchor in the quiet room. "He was gone the moment he thought he could survive without you, Elsa. A man who destroys his foundation deserves to feel the roof collapse. Elsa looked at her reflection in the glass. The woman staring back wasn't a victim or a lady in a white gown. She was the only architect left standing in a city of ruins. The Roche Empire was a pile of ash, and from it, she was finally ready to build something that wouldn't break. The glass and steel of the Hay Global headquarters pierced the clouds, a jagged obsidian needle claiming its place at the summit of the city's skyline. On the observation deck, 80 stories above the streets that once tried to swallow her whole, Elsa W. Barkley stood against the wind. The air up here was thin and cold, vibrating with the silent power of a structure that she had willed into existence. She was no longer the woman in the wine-stained gown, trembling under the weight of a husband's cruelty. Today, she wore a coat of deep midnight blue, her braids caught in a silver clasp that caught the dying light of the sunset. She didn't look down at the city to see if they were watching, she knew they were. From this height, the Roche Plaza, once the pinnacle of her labor, looked like a child's toy, diminished and shadowed by the giant she had built. Behind her, the rhythmic thrum of the building's heart seemed to harmonize with a familiar step. She didn't need to turn to know Day was there. He walked to the edge of the glass, stopping just short of her shoulder. The wind ruffled the collar of his black shirt, exposing the ink on his neck that had once seemed like a warning but now felt like a seal of shared history. "It's finished," Elsa said, her voice carrying a resonance that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with certainty. "The foundations are set. The glass is tempered. It will outlast us both." Day looked out over the horizon, his obsidian eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fading sun. "You didn't just build a skyscraper, Elsa. You built a mirror. When the people in this city look up, they don't see the Hay name. They see the woman who refused to stay broken." Elsa finally turned to him. The power dynamic that had begun as a rescue had transformed into something far more rare, a perfect equilibrium. He was the force that cleared the path, and she was the vision that made the path worth taking. They were two architects of a different kind, one of the shadows and one of the light, standing together at the edge of the world they had remade. "Danny thought he could take my destiny because he gave me a name," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "He didn't realize that the name was just the scaffolding. The structure was always mine." Day reached out, his tattooed hand resting briefly on the glass railing beside hers. He didn't offer a platitude or a soft word. He simply nodded toward the sprawling metropolis below. "The city is waiting for your next move, Elsa. What do we build next?" Elsa looked out at the infinite grid of lights beginning to flicker on in the twilight. She was no longer seeking approval from the elites or validation from a ghost. She was the architect of her own destiny, and the sky was no longer a limit, it was her canvas. "Everything," she replied. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lights of the Hay Tower flared to life, casting a long, unyielding shadow over the ruins of the Roche Empire. Elsa stood tall, her silhouette etched against the stars, the undisputed queen of the skyline she had reclaimed. The gala was a lifetime ago, and the woman who had collapsed on that marble floor was dead. In her place stood a titan, and beside her, a dragon, watching over a city that would never dare to lower its eyes again.